Good evening. It's Tuesday, May 23rd, 2017 at 6:30 in the evening, and this is a study session of the Littleton City Council. It's a joint session with South Suburban Parks and Rec, and our purposes tonight will be to do two study session topics with South Suburban. Those are A and B on our agenda, and that has been posted. Also, before we close out tonight, we'd like to do an item C, which is another update from Mayor Pro Tem Brinkman on fire consolidation issues. If I have that, we're good? Okay, so we'll just plan on item C coming up at the end, and South Suburban doesn't need to stay around for that one unless you wish to, John. So it's my pleasure to introduce John Ostermiller, and he's going to introduce the board for South Suburban Parks.
Thank you, Mayor. I'd like to introduce the South Suburban board members who are here this evening. We are short one member due to illness, but I would like to introduce Pam Eller, Scott LaBreche, and Mike Anderson, members of the South Suburban board. Jim Taylor was not able to make it this evening. I'd also like to introduce our executive director, Rob Hanna, and the main presenters tonight will be Scott Latona, the manager of South Platte Park, and Andy Jennings, director of Parks and Open Space for South Suburban. So with that, unless you have anything else, Bruce?
Just need to make an introduction to the item on the agenda, and then we'll turn it over to Scott. This is agenda item A. It's ID 17-157, South Platte Park Management Plan and First Amendment to the South Platte Park Management Agreement. Scott Latona.
All right, well, thank you all very much. Just to start off with, I had given a general overview back in October when we first presented the update for the management plan, and kind of in the interest of time, I think we'll be just review very quickly the main changes that we've we suggested in the plan at that time, and then what came out of the public review process. South Platte Park is 878 acres along the South Platte River, owned by the City of Littleton, managed by South Suburban Parks and Recreation, and it is managed as a natural open space area. The property was created after the 1965 flood. The park opened in 1983, and the first management plan was approved in 1996. That management plan recommended updates every 5 to 10 years, about every 7 years or so. We've gone through that process in 1999 and in 2009 was the last update. We started this process, actually it was October 25th, 2016 was when I came presented here last. We held a public meeting on December 15th, and then we were collecting comments through emails and in person at the Nature Center through the 18th. And presenting to you tonight to move forward if there's agreement on that. And essentially really looking at what the park was when it was created, which was a large open space in a fairly suburban or somewhat rural area, moving into where it is today, where we have a significant amount of housing and commercial development around the park and significant increases in the use. At one time, the park rangers expressed concern with 180 people per day down in the C470 access area in the park. And as I reported previously, Memorial Weekend last year, we were reporting around 520 people per hour on the Greenway Trail. So the park has significantly changed in how it's being used. And that use goes throughout the year. It goes throughout all hours of the day, all days of the week, at least along the Greenway Trail. In the changes that we brought forth back in October, we defined the management sites. So there is the official acreage of South Platte Park, but there are a number of surrounding properties that are managed as leases, easements, and partnership agreements with some of the surrounding property owners. So the plan reflects some of those things with some updated GIS mapping. We also looked at the easements, over 13 utility easements that cross through the park and are disturbed fairly often for maintenance purposes, and does create management challenges, so really trying to compile those and get a good understanding. 13 major easements, yes. One of the policy changes that we recommend was for collecting to include minerals and crawdad trapping to eliminate commercial level. The state does not have a limit on it with the amount of use that we have in South Platte Park and the productivity of the reservoir lakes. We want it, or the gravel mine lakes. We wanted to try and keep that as more of an individual activity rather than commercial activities. The water rights section was significantly expanded. After the 2003 drought, water became very interesting in the metro area with everybody figuring out ways to get the water before it evaporates or seeps away, and so water rights changed significantly over the last 10 to 12 years. And then we expanded the wildlife management section to give a little more detail. Again, managing urban wildlife can be more challenging. A lot more limitations on when and where animals can move, so trying to put more definition into that. The park hours have always been sunrise to sunset. The Greenway Trail has become a regional transportation route, a commuter route, and so this plan, we recommended some language to define later travel on the trail as long as it remains on the Greenway Trail, but the park hours still being sunrise to sunset, so there's some clarification in the plan for that. Also looking at north of South Platte Park, there are either dual trails on either side of the river or plans for dual trails along many of those sections. We don't feel that that's appropriate in South Platte Park, but we are recommending going up to a wider trail width if we do extend all of those things in the future to help reduce some of the constriction if it does remain the one trail going through.
And Scott, what you're talking about there is the paved trail, not the crusher fine.
Correct, yes. The paved trail is currently a 10-foot width in the park, 8-foot width in some other areas. And it seems appropriate to go to a 12-foot. We did update to the signage plan, get away from the brown wood signs and kind of allow, while staying within the concept of is minimal signage and signage that is complementary to the trail system, to update it for modern materials and branding. The city and state rules regarding swimming and wading would potentially prohibit tubing and fly fishing the way it's worded, so we've added some clarification to allow those very popular activities. What was that?
Fly fishing and wading, not the bathing.
Well, we're taking out the term wading as a restriction and turning it to bathing to allow people to wade into the river and do fly fishing as opposed to kind of the leisurely sitting down or actually bathing in the river and swimming, yes. And then also recommending a policy on motorized remote control vehicles. Seeing a lot of different kinds of things in the park that impact visitors with sound and activities that they find inconsistent with the natural area. And so putting some restrictions in place on that.
Scott, do drones come under that category?
The FAA controls airspace, and so this would be restrictions to launching and landing and would allow us to communicate with drone pilots about the impacts on the park users and the wildlife, but we, my understanding, cannot restrict airspace.
Scott, and the motorized, state legislature just passed recent legislation on electric-aided bicycles.
Yes.
Do you want to elaborate a little bit on whether that's permitted on the Greenway and such?
Yes. South Suburban has if I can remember all the initials, other motorized vehicle policy that kind of defines what is permitted on the Greenway, what's considered a accessibility aid, and what would be considered recreational devices. And that policy does apply to the Greenway as it goes through South Platte Park. So there would be limitations on the horsepower and maximum speed and width of devices allowed on the Greenway Trail. There are certain electrical bikes that are permitted on the trail, but there are limitations and they would have to maintain all the current park rules.
And where can someone find those if they wanted to?
The bikes themselves?
Well, not the policy. Not the bikes, the policy.
Let's see. I'm trying to think. The South Suburban, we can certainly put it out there. I'm not sure if it is publicly on the website currently. I know it's been shared in public meetings for.
It might be good to share with the bike shops too.
Yes, and we have made contact with the local shop owners about that.
So Scott,
Yes,
on the drones, they can fly over, but not launch or land?
correct. Yes. And we have seen motorized boats out on the lakes. We're seeing new motorized submarine drones with cameras and things that people are using. So trying to get ahead of some of the technology that could impact the experience out there. All right, if there aren't any other questions about those, I guess my binder clip is leading us forward here. The things that have not changed since the original concept of the plan, the master plan in 1993 is a core habitat area as opposed to some of the more recreational use areas, and that is currently defined as the Cooley Lake area. The plan talks about how the history has evolved around that, but that core zone is still maintained in this plan. And then use intensity zones, having areas where you could have more of a solitude type experiences to some of the more heavily used areas where it's more urban type fishing. Fishermen are close to each other, kind of fishing in the same zones. This plan, as part of the comment process, we did add a little more definition to what those zones might look like or the experience might look like. The plan does not change prioritizing the natural area experience over organized or intensive recreation, so still avoiding any of the large race events, organized activities, anything that would require setup of facilities in the park. And trail and facility standards haven't changed, so our walking trail width and surfaces, we're not recommending any changes to those things. We're not recommending any additional facilities or benches or construction in the park. And then specifically looking at the East Trail Wildlife Area and the experience along there, the width of the trail and the number of access points, that is all maintained since 1983 and further clarified in this version.
Scott, before you leave that on the what isn't new, couple of items just to talk about what's changing around the park. You have the Columbine Valley development. How does that impact where you're at with the plan? How do you deal with other access points such as the development that may occur along what we've historically referred to as the Enzer property as well? So you kind of have boundary issues with those. Can you just talk about how did you deal with the plan relative to those?
Yes, and that's where I think the 1983 plan was pretty forward-looking in the sense of recognizing that there would likely be development along the East Trail border, the Santa Fe Park, and indicating that 2 access points would be appropriate. More than that would be too many. Less than that, probably would not meet the demands of the community. So that those 2 points are still maintained. They have yet to be defined. I think they're probably fairly logical as far as what the best places for those would be, but maintaining those 2 points, and then the development along the Wild Plum Farm boundary, which would be the north shore of the Cooley Lake Wildlife Area. This plan would not permit access or trails in from that direction, and that has informed the referrals that we've given back to the developers on those to fence design and buffer from private property and those kinds of things.
And how do you, recognizing development will probably occur during this plan period before there's the next review, how are you going to apprise whether those restrictions and intent with regard to plan are actually being met?
Well, I think that's where our partners come into play with you guys in Columbine Valley. Columbine Valley is a perfect example. When they were going through the approval process of Wild Plum, they took our referral comments and they made sure that that those comments were included in the development plan, and as approved now, they are in there with our recommended fence design, no access points, and everything like that. So they use this plan as a basis to drive that those comments and whatnot. And I think our expectation would be that all of our partners accept and embrace the master plan and help us make sure that those are protected. So I think that's the simple answer: is we need your help, because again, we're not the authority that's approving these development plans. It's it's the municipalities that border this that we need help from as well too.
And one other question on what isn't new, but is a question that I get asked by a minority, and know they always end up being underrepresented in the public comments. I'll get closer to the microphone before somebody makes that comment, is I know I've talked about it before, dealing with a special event access. I'll call it a special event because I don't intend it to be anything more than that. But where some folks that have had historical access to Cooley Lake might be able to have a few hours of fishing once or twice a year as a heritage item for some of the folks that have enjoyed that. Doesn't seem that the plan contemplates that. Is that ever something that you see being addressed or at least tried?
In the 2009, the current plan, this was a question that was brought by the board and council, and that plan included a series of options. It kind of looked at the cost and feasibility of doing various types of permits and access, and what the costs of those things would be, what the benefits would be. And at that time, board and council had voted to keep it as a natural wildlife area with the restricted access. Staff recommendation would be to maintain that. Opening it for even limited periods of time, in our belief, would be creating a demand and an expectation that increase the challenges year-round for maintaining closure of that area. Ultimately, the policy decision does come to the elected bodies, but the recommendations, I think we could dredge those back up from the 2009 plan and look at those, but I don't think that the concept has changed.
And it might be nice to just bring those up again, or at least make those available as we're considering this for adoption. Please.
In the public comment period through the fall and into December, primarily what we were seeing was support of the current policies, and I believe everyone was provided with the exact comments that we were provided with. And so a lot of support for managing the park the way it is currently. There were a few that asked for some detail or clarifications that were either addressed or changed in the plan. A couple of editorial and grammatical changes. And then some comments addressing the proposed limits of acceptable change model. So in October, I presented a plan that had a very strong move away from carrying capacity and introduction of a limits of acceptable change management style. And through a involved educational process looking at what that would involve, we've changed some of the language in this current plan. So the model has many merits in terms of setting what you would expect your visitor experiences to be, and then setting indicators, measurements, and managing the park towards those in more of a restrictive fashion where something would trigger a change in management. And to really do this plan properly would take really good in-depth visitor study, which we felt was beyond the scope of updating the current plan as possible. So if there were further direction, it would probably take further resources as well to get fully into that degree of management. We have adopted what we could from that process. And that has led to more detail on the intended experience in the management zone, so describing what the experience is intended to be in the low, moderate, and high use zones. Looking at Appendix 2, the master plan set 4 goals for the park, and the previous versions of the plan had some procedural things to meet those goals. This time around, we've taken and tried to make those more specific objectives so that we could actually work towards ensuring that those goals are being met. Mm-hmm. And then we are working on starting a process to figure out what the key indicators are in terms of use, impact, tolerance for social trails, and trying to figure out what that baseline is for future management recommendations. So that's the direction we've gone with those types of things.
Scott, before you leave that slide, the key indicators, it seems to me there is a population that doesn't speak at all, and that is the wildlife. And I think we need to make sure in key indicators that we're doing in-depth studies of the habits of the wildlife in terms of their return to the site and their the populations, the changes in patterns in terms of use, with significant encroachment to the boundaries of the site with both residential and commercial properties. We need to be very careful about disturbing the wildlife habitat and the wildlife populations.
Yes, and the park does have several long-term research projects that we have maintained, winter waterfowl census, migratory bird count, which are two of the primary characteristic values for the park. We're also working with MSU, CU in Denver, and a couple of other universities where they're bringing their classes out and they're doing wetland studies, chemistry of the soils, and trying to direct any student projects to help collect some of that data. So yeah, we definitely do appreciate that. It's not currently part of our staffing plan to be able to do robust studies on all of the resources, but we are trying to figure out which key indicators we can efficiently monitor throughout time.
Scott, when you talk about key indicators, I know that there's a strong use of the Carson Nature Center as an education resource for folks, and sometimes schools have had difficulty getting in the line. Do you see anything changing in being able to address, to some extent, the limited experience that some urban and suburban livers have to something that might be a little more of a natural environment?
Yes, at this point, we are very close to the capacity that our current facility and staffing are able to provide. So we are investigating some different options, including programming up at Reynolds Landing with the shelter and restrooms that are now available up there. We are doing some prototyping through this year, and kind of keeping our eyes open for the change in paradigm that would allow us to serve more classes without degrading the experience for students as well as the park users.
And one of the big things that came out of our recent master plan process that we went through is more connection to nature from our community. That came out very strong. So one of the deliverables out of that plan is a recommendation to look at the potential of developing a Carson nature trailer that we can take out into the community that may not have the opportunity to come to Carson Nature Center or you know, some of the schools or alternate locations like Scott, because not everybody has to come to South Platte Park to experience all the great learning possibilities and education that is there. So again, one of our things that we're going to look at is trying to bring Carson Nature Center out into the community and looking at different options for that as well too.
And that being said, if you do get specific requests, we do have capacity from November through March. And it is a fabulous experience, it really is. And we do have it adapted for weather conditions, but you know, that is the place that we're still filling where we still have a small amount of capacity. Are there any other questions on the management plan update before we go on to the agreement? So concurrent with this is a proposal to amend the agreement between the City of Littleton and South Suburban. And essentially just looking to update it. It has not been changed since the agreement was initially put in place in 1983. And a couple of the major changes in that agreement, a lot of the detail was how to create and approve the management plan, and the wording that we're proposing in this amendment is looking at applying that same process to all construction projects or park improvements or major changes in policy. And that's been a practice of these bodies through time, but we're just kind of putting that down in writing so that we would have joint meetings and votes before moving forward on any of those items. There was a fair amount of detail about equipment that was loaned from the city that has long since been retired, so removing all of that language. But clarifying the purchasing and the joint ownership, currently all of the capital projects are shared 50-50, with the exception of some of the patrol vehicles that do get used out in the district more, and that's a 35-65 split. And that's all being monitored in the annual budgets and just kind of clarifying that process into the future. Updating liability insurance requirements to follow along with the state standards and kind of modern economy. And then the last one is there is a water gauge at C470 that is related to the jointly owned water rights between the city of Littleton and South Suburban. And this proposal would transfer the day-to-day management to staff who are actually out on site. So rather than having city staff coming out to monitor that, myself or park rangers would be going out to ensure it's calibrated and functioning on a regular basis and manage the contract for maintenance. That is everything I have to present, and be happy to address any other questions.
Peggy?
Yeah, so I have a concern about the frequency of updates. I would think that we should be reviewing every 5 years, or if something is changing significantly in the plan area. I think it's good to do that, just to go through the review more often than possibly 10 years. So if there's something major changing the population area, that is close to the park, I think that should trigger a review to see, do we need to restrict things, make things more liberal, whatever. But just, it's not painful to do this, I think, but I think it's good to have eyes on this, go through this kind of assessment.
Any other comments about that idea?
I would just say, do you mean like a full review of the management plan like we're going through now?
No, I think if we did it more frequently, we wouldn't need so much as we did this time. So we'd be getting the updates. Well, geez, if we'd had a major water event that impacted the park, that would perhaps trigger, quite apart from how many years has it been, right? So just touching base, and it wouldn't, and if nothing had been happening, it would just be, hey, it's the same old place.
Scott, did the amendment address that?
I was just looking at the language of that. It talks about any major projects would go to both. So I'm not sure that addresses it specifically.
Yeah, I don't.
But I do know we've had the joint breakfast annually, and about every 2 to 3 years, I've been invited in to give an update.
Yeah. And I think that kind of thing removes some of the intensity of the more spread out every 5 or 10 years. It's keeping tabs in a nice way.
Phil?
Scott, at least through your slides, you mentioned staff would begin gathering statistics that can lead to further analysis that as far as the use of the park. Might it be okay to talk about a regular presentation of those statistics to the bodies so that indeed what we're doing is keeping tabs by saying, how is the use the same, or how is it changing and what pressure that's putting, but rather than talking about it in terms of a review of the plan, which could be triggered by taking a look at the numbers, it can actually become part of that statistics gathering and saying, hey, we're going to share those and put that in kind of a regular cycle.
Yes, as part of the management plan process, we currently do a summary that includes a chart of key indicators, and I'm not sure at which point in the process that level of detail gets published. But currently, those indicators are primarily the number of participants, number of trail users. But I could see that expanding into some of the natural indicators and experience indicators.
And I think that would be at least an easy way to say, hey, do we need to be thinking about something different if that's the case?
If I could add, something like a dashboard might work really well, that pick whatever those key indicators are. Wildlife could be included in that, as well as population and any other notice of wear and degradation or water event or whatever. And you could just keep that going. Here's why I'm suggesting that is the next 5 or 10 years, I think, is going to be a tremendous amount of pressure over and above the past 5 or 10 years, and that's been considerable. And I think we may reach the point where we have trouble keeping up, either protecting the wildlife or keeping the facilities to that level that we want them to be. A dashboard might help us begin to see that happening. Any other
That
things?
would actually be, another benefit of that would be budget season. So if we do see some things like that that might require some, like when we brought the bike rangers in and those types of things where it might require, I know the weed mitigation and all of that stuff, that those kind of ongoing bits of information I think would help when we do get to budget season and we're not surprised by something.
And just even more on that, and I certainly don't want to suggest there be a different funding mechanism today, but I don't know if we're going to be able to, as we look way to the future, develop the kind of funds necessary out of the operating funds of the city and South Suburban to do the things that we're going to need to do. And at some point, we have to think about that. And, there are fees that parks charge to perhaps people that don't live within the area and already contribute through their taxes. I don't know how you collect them, how you do all that, but we have so many visitors, thousands and thousands and thousands of people visiting through there that are not contributing to the upkeep. It's a future issue, I think, that maybe that dashboard would help us see the need too.
That may also alert us to trying to get grants, various kinds of grants, in a time, well, number one, trying to get them and hopefully getting them, but being able to apply in timely ways to try to get them.
Yeah, we've heard so many times in the past, and it's true, that, the maintenance is the thing. The maintenance is the cost that is tough to keep up, so just offering suggestions. Other ideas? Thank you, Scott.
Nice job, Scott.
Yes, thank you. Well done.
So this brings us to Agenda Item B. Agenda Item B is ID 17-156, Progress Park Preliminary Master Plan Presentation. So for the folks that are watching this or will look at it in the future, we're looking at 2 different master plans in this study session. We just covered the South Platte Park. Now we're moving to Progress Park, which is in the northern part of the city. And Steve, can you present that? Steve White is one of the planners at South Suburban Parks and Rec.
I'm going to give you a little introduction, and then we'll have Mark Taylor with Arc'teryx give us the presentation on the master plan. I'd like to remind everyone or inform those that aren't aware of why.
Can you move the mic just a little bit towards you? There you go.
Why we are doing this project. And it's simply that the amenities in the park don't meet the needs of today's users. The existing restroom and shelter, which is a single structure, was completed in 1968. It requires routine maintenance. The restroom does not meet ADA requirements, and the structure itself sits within the 100-year floodplain. Given those facts, we thought it was good to start at the beginning, which would be the master plan process to set a vision for the park moving forward. Also like to point out before Mark gets going that this does align with the recently adopted South Suburban Master Plan as well as the Littleton Parks Recreation and Trails Master Plan. More information on that can be found in your correspondence there. So.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You'll hear me okay? Great. So yeah, again, my name is Mark Taylor. I'm a landscape architect with the Architera Group. And we were contracted through South Suburban to work on a preliminary master plan for improvements to Progress Park. So what we just wanted to do today is walk through the process that we've gone through to arrive at our preliminary master plan and then kind of step through that master plan in a little bit of detail. So the first thing is the funding for the master planning process is primarily from an Arapahoe County planning grant for $60,000, and then there was a $6,000 cash match that was 50-50 split between South Suburban and City of Littleton. So, brief overview of our design process. We were hired at the beginning of 2016 to really start looking at Progress Park. And we started with a meeting on March 1st to meet with South Suburban staff and talk about some of the issues that they had seen with Progress Park, talk about what did work well, and also, maybe more importantly, what didn't work very well. For the next couple of months, we were really on an information gathering mission. So we got a survey, we reviewed floodplains and some other kinds of things going on in the park. We had some public meetings beginning of May and June of 2016 for some public input. And then we also had an online survey through the Open Littleton website. So we got a lot of good information as well. So we took all of that information that we had, both site information and information from staff and the public, and developed a couple of concepts through the summer of last year. And we looked at one concept that tried to keep Progress Park very much the way it is now with some minor modifications, try to help that function a little bit better. And we looked at another concept that made some pretty significant changes and sort of rethought how the park might function. Those were shared with Littleton in July of last year. And then we met with South Suburban staff to review the kind of final preliminary concepts for those in August. So the direction that we got from South Suburban staff was really to try to marry those two a little bit, get some elements from both of those concepts, and move forward to prepare a preliminary master plan. So that's what we did through the fall of last year, through 2016, and then that was shared with Littleton staff in October, and then we had a public meeting in November of last year to review that. So looking at Progress Park a little bit, I imagine most of you are pretty familiar with this, but for orientation, Bellevue Avenue is on the north. North is up on this image. Hickory Street is on the west there. Cornerstone Park is west of the park, west of Progress Park. Bellevue Park is on the north side of Bellevue Avenue there. And then Progress Park sort of sits down below Bellevue Avenue in sort of a basin. So it's surrounded by a really nice riparian area along Big Dry Creek. Big Dry Creek and Big Dry Creek Trail sort of follows that same alignment. There's a parking lot on the south side of the park that holds currently 91 cars. There are 3 primary ball fields in the park, so 2 baseball fields with a backstop and then 1 multi-use field. There's a playground, shelter, restroom building. There's a pond that's currently used to irrigate. It holds water to irrigate Cornerstone Park. And there's also some amenities there, as like a fishing pier and a few things like that.
Before you leave the map, can you point out where the floodplain boundaries are?
Sure. Well, we actually don't have that shown on this plan. Oh, yes, we do. I'm sorry. So the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, is actually out here, this dashed line right here. Sorry, that's not true. It's this one out here.
Yes.
So basically, the entire park, including the restaurant building, is in the 100-year floodplain. So that's a significant constraint for some improvements that may be considered in the park. So I'm sorry for the text-heavy slide here.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
We obviously haven't had a 100-year flood, at least while most of us are alive. Has that been underwater at all?
Yeah, I think significant portions of Progress Park have been underwater. Do you know how recently?
I know growing up, it was like a swamp at times. I think you probably were down there a lot. Yeah, it was definitely been flooded.
Got soggy.
Yeah.
A fairly good portion of the park is actually in the 10-year floodplain.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay,
When-
okay.
When we had that high water level that everyone really experienced, there were parts of it that were very soggy, I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and that's made the baseball diamonds unusable too sometimes, so it really, because I remember we'd have to cancel games because it was too mushy.
Sure. So based on the feedback that we had, both from the public and from South Suburban staff, there's several issues that we really wanted to address, and I won't go through these necessarily point by point, but I think some of the main themes that we heard are that there's some significant issues with circulation. It's difficult to find the current parking lot. Once you find the parking lot, to get into the park, you have to walk across Big Dry Creek Trail, so there's some potential conflict with trail users there. A lot of the elements throughout the park are sort of spread out. So if you are at one backstop, it's a long walk to get to the restroom. Or if your kids want to play at the playground and you've got another kid you're trying to watch play baseball, they're very separated. So there's some issues with that. Parking is a concern because there's really not enough parking for the current use. As I said, there's 91 current spaces, and based on the number of ball fields, probably need at least 180. So as a result, we have people that are parking in other parking areas that they can find surrounding the park. Some of those are for residential areas. Some of that is informal parking along Hickory. Another thing that we heard a lot about is outdated facilities in the park. So the shelter, the restroom, the playground doesn't really offer a lot of play value. There's some concern about a lack of an identity, really, for the park. It's sort of a park that in fact, one resident called it a pass-through park. Said that, when they're going to go to a playground, they'll pass through Progress Park to get to Bellevue Park that has a better playground. Another big issue is a lack of connectivity between Cornerstone Park and Progress Park. They're located on the plan, very close to each other, but there's no good way to get between the two for pedestrians. So, in general, what we heard is that Progress Park really has two functions. On one hand, it's sort of a neighborhood level park for all the people who live right around it, but it doesn't function particularly well for that. People have a hard time getting there because there's not great connectivity from all the high density residential that could get to the park. The playground doesn't really serve them very well. A lot of the facilities are outdated. And then it also has a community level kind of need. So there's people who drive here to go to baseball and soccer games. So hard to find parking. Once you do find parking, you've got a long way to walk. So a lot of issues there with sort of both of those uses. This is an opportunities and constraints plan that we put together. So I won't go through this in great detail, but basically the red is looking at some constraint issues that would impact potential designs. And the green is looking at opportunities, so something that sort of is something that could be enhanced or used to thought about during the design process. These are some bubble diagrams of the preliminary concepts that we reviewed with South Suburban. Again, one that was looking at kind of wholesale changes to the park and one that kept things fairly similar to how they are. Again, I won't go through these in great detail unless somebody has some really specific questions about those. So this is our preliminary master plan for renovations to Progress Park. And in general, what we're trying to do is keep some of the major facilities in their approximate locations that they are for a couple of reasons. One is it's a cost-effective way of trying to improve the park. Another is that there are some constraints on the site in terms of floodplain and just the size of open area that sort of dictate that some of these uses would be in these general locations. For a very brief overview, we'll go through some of these elements in a little more detail, but the parking lot down here is recommended to be expanded to add 32 additional spaces in this area. So it stays in the same location, just gets renovated. Formalizing parking along Hickory Street. So that gives us a total of 185 spaces, I think, altogether. Looking at improving connectivity from Progress Park up into Cornerstone Park for pedestrians. Looking at some formalized connectivity between the park and nearby residential areas. So there are several of those surrounding the park, you can see. Most of these are locations of current habit paths where people are finding their way into the park, kind of walking through the woods. You can see the location of the ball fields is generally where they are now, but we've reoriented those. So the main viewer area is kind of toward the center core of the park. So everybody's a little bit closer to restroom, playground, some of those other elements. And I think that the other really important thing that we've looked at here in terms of circulation is realigning the Big Dry Creek Trail. It currently follows the creek, and what we're looking at doing is actually bringing it more around the north side of the park over this way. So the intent here is to sort of reduce conflict between trail users and this core area of the park.
Mark, did you get many comments with regard the distance from the parking areas to the shelter? Did that come up much? Because, I mean, that continues to be, or at least from how I look at this, would continue to be an issue for at least some folks.
Yeah, I don't know that we heard specifically to the shelter. I think it was really to sort of all park elements. Yeah. One of the things that we did look at is trying to find a way to bring parking closer into those kind of main facilities in the park. And we found two things. One, if we do that, we lose some significant facilities in the park. We probably lose a ball field to make that happen. There's just not enough room. And the other is it becomes a pretty expensive proposition because you've got to cross the creek. So you end up with at least one, if not two, vehicular bridges over the creek, which becomes cost prohibitive pretty quickly.
So I have a question. The comments that were made earlier by the folks that remember this when they were growing up, are we still?
I still remember it.
Are we still dealing with a boggy problem?
You know, we didn't hear a lot from maintenance staff about that really being an issue. I mean, for the most part, the turf is in good condition, and we didn't hear a lot about drainage or those kind of issues.
Okay, that was my concern. Thank you.
I have a quick question on
Sure.
people that would be parking along Hickory. Is their only way that they get into the park would be to take that long trail to the
Yeah.
Central Plaza?
Yeah,
So
Go ahead.
if they wanted to go to that upper ball field, it would,
Right.
is there any way, there's no way to get around other than that way?
That's right. That's something that we spent a lot of time looking at. So one of the big constraints, it's an opportunity and a constraint in Progress Park, is the significant grade around the south side of the park. And unfortunately, that kind of creates a barrier between that parking either in Cornerstone Park or along Hickory into the site. So really, there's not a great way. I'm trying to remember, it's something like 35 feet of grade that you need to try to make up. And at an ADA slope, there really isn't a good way to do that without very expensive ramps and landings. You've got a bridge crossing. So ultimately, we looked at a few options here. We also looked at some options up along Bellevue. There's just not a great way to make that connection.
So I haven't been to the park recently with kids, but when I did, that was a really big problem because we would park on Hickory and then the kids would drag equipment bags and everything else out to Bellevue, walk along the little path there on the edge of Bellevue, and then slide down, get all their stuff down. I mean, that was routine. That was how they got to that ball field. And I am familiar also, we've had some kids tragic loss of life right at that location also. I don't know that it was exactly because of that circumstance, but they had gotten up onto Bellevue and got hit by a car on Bellevue. So there is a bridge or a tunnel that goes under, where the creek goes under up to Bellevue Park. So that's kind of a natural spot too. But I have to say, we really have an obligation to make that safe. And I don't know what the answer would be as you've looked at it. But kids are going to do what kids are going to do, and we've got to protect them in that space with something that works.
Yeah, I think the intent here would be to formalize this entry so it's an obvious place to go. And while it's not great, it's improved from having to walk all the way to this corner from how it is currently. I think another important part of this, though, is going to be to close off access here, because you're right, that's it's not an ideal place to be sending people, particularly when there's really no pedestrian facilities there at all.
And I have no idea what it takes to correct the edges of Bellevue. That's a roadway issue, but that's what it's going to take, I think.
Along that line too, when you have the steps up in the top left there, it caught my attention when I was looking at this the other night. It seems like not a good place for an access. I think for what many of the reasons you just said, because Bellevue is not a walkable stretch right through there.
That's right.
Yeah, so is that part of the plan for Clement then, to put in that stepped?
No, so this is really looking at a future connection.
Cornerstone.
Yeah, so the intent here is a future connection. At some point, if Bellevue is upgraded, the intent would be to put a pedestrian facility, some type of a sidewalk along Bellevue to make that more pedestrian friendly. And at that point, I think then there's an important connection there.
Yeah, Mark, a couple other comments I have too is then, one of the things that I've always liked about Progress Park is that not all parks are created equal, and that park has always had the feel of being kind of a remote type park, kind of a wooded type park, an adventurous type park for kids. It isn't you go to Bellevue and that's definitely a public park. I mean, it has that feel to it, picnic baskets and all that good stuff. When you go to Progress Park, it's always, and it still is, I still go there. It's kind of like an adventure to go there. It isn't just your run-of-the-mill park. That's one of the exciting things about it. Parking has always been a challenge there, without doubt, and that's a difficult thing. But I think the idea of, I would just hate to see it turn into to take away that adventure of catching the crawdads and all that other good stuff.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. So one of the things that we heard from the public is, one of the things we asked is what's sacred? What should we just not mess with? And the biggest thing we heard was the riparian area, that it's got to stay there. And I think people wanted more access to that, but we definitely don't want to see clearing of trees to make that happen.
Right.
So, in my opinion, Progress Park has a really unique and desirable character. So Cornerstone is sort of the regional, big ball fields kind of park. Bellevue has that really high intensive use along the creek, but what Progress offers is the riparian area. And it's got this really nice sort of naturalized channel, and it sort of feels like all of those other elements fit down in that little valley. And I think
and going through that tunnel from Bellevue Park has always been like going through a different time zone.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love it. That's part of the exciting.
Completely agree. So that's something that I think we really want to maintain and enhance and really celebrate as part of this master plan.
The other part is leaving Bellevue Park on the north side. Well, Mark, and I know you've talked about it as a barrier, is there any way to create a switchback decline from that parking area and to get to that access? I know it would require a bridge over the creek, and whether that is just terrifically impractical or that is something that could be a future consideration.
So I think the simple answer is yes, it's possible. We have to think about the trade-offs. So I think it's something that we could consider. To have a ramp along that, you're probably going to lose all the trees on that portion. So we're just talking about sort of the character that we want to try to maintain, and you've got this trade-off there. And then there is the cost element of that. So I think it's something that's worth exploring, but I think the reality is it requires lots of structure, retaining walls, bridges, and things that are going to change the character of that portion of the channel.
What about a trail through the trees?
Well, I think that's what we have here.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, that's kind of the amount of distance that we need to take up that grade.
I have a question about the parking, formalizing the parking so close to Bellevue, keep extending that out, because right now there's no formalized parking there, I don't believe. By formalizing that, because one of the things I've noticed there, and it is a dangerous thing. I see a lot of people parking there, not that they should be, but they park there for the overflow of the Pirates Cove, and then they go across Bellevue there. Would that just enhance that? And would that open up some liabilities?
So I think that is a possibility. People are going to use that parking if they can find that to get to Pirates Cove. I'm trying to remember what the pedestrian,
So there is a pedestrian crossing on.
Pedestrian crossing up further up the hill.
Yes.
They have to walk up the hill.
west.
But I see people going across Bellevue right there just to get, with kids in tow, just to get over to Pirates Cove and not go up the hill and then across. So I'm just wondering if that would just make that.
That's why we
more of a
encourage
tempting-
parking, that's why we have a joint use agreement with Pirates Cove, and that's why that signal was actually put in.
It was
I
up
think-
above.
Yeah, Inglewood actually paid for that signal, so, but as a result of us providing that overflow and that pedestrian crossing, that was, again, paid for by Inglewood, I believe. So we do try and encourage, people to park in that and use that light, but I think as noted out, until there's some improvements on Bellevue Avenue, that there's really nothing that we can do in that.
I have to say that Bruce and Phil both have a point with that north ball field. The access through the south end of the park or the middle of the park from parking on Hickory is so long that people aren't going to do that. They're going to go up to Bellevue. So we either need to do something on Bellevue or a stairway or something to get from the parking on Hickory down to the north ball field, because there's no other way for them to get to the north ball field if they're parking in that, along Hickory, which is the logical place to park if that's the ball field that you're going to.
Sure.
So we're sort of creating a situation that encourages them to go up on Bellevue, and Bellevue is not something you want to have kids going on.
I agree with you. I think one of the challenges there is that South Suburban doesn't, the Bellevue right-of-way continues far enough out that there's not an opportunity for us to improve or to provide those kind of facilities to make the access point there. So there's probably some coordination with CDOT that would need to happen to make that a possibility.
Is CDOT the one that owns Bellevue?
Yes, CDOT owns the right-of-way. They tend to focus between the curbs, and so they tend to look at local government to kind of manage the pedestrian issues. That's kind of their practice here in the state. So if there is a desire for us to pursue something, I'm sure they would cooperate with us, but they'd look to local government here to try to solve that problem.
Well, it'd take years to notice we did something, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and just while you're discussing this strange location there, the Englewood city line with Littleton City line on the old ball field was about the third baseline. It's not on the roadway. It's into that field. So there's some other issues too that we need to work out. Anything we're saying we want to do on that corner, it's really Englewood.
Okay. So we'll look at a couple of elements in detail. We've got some images to show what some of these elements could look like. And I want to kind of point out that the images I'm going to show are just inspiration images. They're not specifically what we'd be proposing for Progress Park, but just to kind of give everybody an opportunity to sort of have some creativity and think about how this could work. So one of the things we want to talk about is entry signage to the park, and we've got a few levels of that. So you can see these two locations at the corner of Hickory and Bellevue, and then at the entrance to the parking lot. We think it's important to have some pretty significant signage to show what those areas could be. So this is a blow-up of those two areas. And, you know, there may be an opportunity. Oh, right here? Thank you. That's much easier. I'm not smart enough to use this. So anyway, some type of significant signage that you could see coming by on Bellevue as you're entering the park. Right now, there's a relatively small sign that most people probably don't even know that the Progress Park is there. Then once you've exited your car, we think it's important to have another sort of pedestrian scale entry at those two locations as you're leaving the parking lots. So again, lots of ways that we could do that. It could be some type of a gateway or entry columns, but something that signifies the entrance to Progress Park. And I think there's also some opportunities both at these locations and where you would enter the park from Big Dry Creek Trail, which we don't have indicated here, to have some sort of more minor entry features that would relate to what's happening at the other locations as well. We think it's really important for people that are coming along Big Dry Creek Trail to have some indicator that, oh, this is Progress Park, that there's a real identity for the park itself. This is the realignment of Big Dry Creek Trail. As I mentioned, it currently follows the alignment of the channel. So we wanted to move that away. As I said, the biggest reason is really to reduce user conflict between trail users and park users. But it also, by moving that, lets the core area of the park have a more intimate connection to Big Dry Creek itself and kind of enhances that connectivity to the creek. This is some of what we've talked about as well. This is improving connectivity to and around Progress Park, so making those connections to the residential areas, and then maybe most importantly, making that connection to Cornerstone Park. So for this next image, we're going to kind of blow up the area right around the core of the park. So really what we're looking at here is what those sort of main features would be. And we've got a central plaza located right over here. This is one of the backstops. So in that area, there's a large group shelter, a restroom building that's separated from that and sort of centrally located in the park, and then a playground area over here. I'll also point out that there are a couple of other shelters, one for the playground and one providing access, seating area right along the creek with some steps to interact with the creek a little bit. So the intent here for the structures is to have some type of a custom structure to help give a unique identity to Progress Park. There's a lot of ways that we could design those. A lot of what we heard in the public meetings is to have sort of a nature theme. You know, we've been talking about this natural corridor and how important that is, so I think the intent would be to celebrate that in the playground, and that could be a mix of natural elements like boulders and logs, and also some prefabricated post and deck equipment that has some what I'll call semi-custom features that make those sort of a more natural design theme. The other thing we wanted to talk about is the layout of the ball fields. We've talked about that some already. But really the intent here, as I mentioned, is to bring all of those main uses closer to that core area, so the circulation throughout the park is a little bit easier for people to manage.
Just out of curiosity,
Yep.
how far is it from the plaza to that upper baseball field,
That is a great question.
roughly?
So let's see.
Maybe it's not. Oh, I see.
Perfect, thank you. So, yeah, so the scale's 100 feet, so it's probably somewhere around 400 feet.
Okay. So, I mean, if somebody parked in the lower lot to go to the upper field, it's really not huge walk.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long walk carrying a bag of equipment and those kind of things, you know.
But if you're 12 years old, yeah.
That's right.
And all those things have wheels on them anymore anyway, so. I was just curious if we were making more of it than we really need to as far as the distance goes. Because if you look at the ball fields, South Suburban ball fields at Cornerstone, if you park at the front end of the parking lot and you're going to those upper fields, it's got to be probably that far also. It's just not through a park, it's through a parking lot.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank
Well,
you.
the problem is if you don't park in that lot's full and you gotta park
Well,
up against Hickory.
yeah.
That's quite a little bit more walk, but still, it's doable.
I think part of the frustration there is that when you park, you can see your destination.
I can't get there from here, though.
It's like climbing a 14er, you keep seeing it. And so you're tempted to take the shortest route that you can see, which gets you back on Bellevue.
Right,
So
you're right.
Mark,
it's the
when we're
temptation.
asking the question about can you shorten the access from that Hickory parking to that north field? And we're saying, what are some solutions to shorten that so that they don't necessarily have to go all the way through the core? I mean, if their purpose is really to the ball field, and that's when the parking issue becomes significant, is when the ball fields are being used. How can that happen? And I know you've talked about drawbacks and trade-offs and such, but maybe seeing those more concretized before we actually say this is good would be a good step. And, you know, Rob, you can kind of help me with that, but that would be a thought to say, take a look at that.
Yeah, I mean, this is a master plan stage, so that's exactly what we're trying to figure out here at a global, 30,000 foot level. What are the goals that we're trying to accomplish through here? So I think those are all valid comments, and there's going to be trade-offs no matter what. Either a longer walk or, in my experience over the last 25 years, I don't think I've built a park that somebody was happy about the distance between the parking lot and whatever facility it is. So, but I do understand your comments, and I do appreciate the thought that you're putting into it. So I think that is something that we can include in a goal of the master plan, is to continually look at options. And again, maybe it's a partnership with the city if CDOT allows for some improvements along Bellevue. Is there a way to scooch that bridge, a little bit closer to the, in between the two? There may be some smaller options, but I think what we're looking for tonight is an acknowledgement that this is the master plan. And if we need to make a stronger statement on a goal of trying to figure out some way to make the parking closer to the facilities, then I think that's entirely appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, I love the redirection of the Big Dry Creek Trail and what's happened with regard to the core of the park. It's just that north ball field, folks are going to find a shorter distance. And if we don't at least look at different ways to accommodate that, we may have other issues.
I personally think the best way to accommodate that is a partnership with CDOT to get pedestrian access across here, and then probably a set of stairs on the far side over here. And provide ADA access at another location, and not try to get across the creek, not try to do something that really disturbs that slope, some of those.
And if that's the case, let's start those conversations sooner rather than later.
So that would be CDOT and the city of Englewood as well?
Yeah, probably.
That private parking on the north side, or the east side, I assume that's for the apartment complex?
Yes.
That's up the hill, too.
Is
So
that
on
is that
the-
steep?
Been down there many a time.
On the west side, I'm trying to remember what I've seen over there. How wide is the creek?
The creek in this area? The creek itself is probably 10 feet, 10, 12 feet.
And how deep?
I think typically it's a foot or less.
So what I'm imagining is that people going or coming, some of them are going to decide, I'm just going to walk through the creek.
You don't see that now. The creek isn't really the deterrent, it's the slope. It's a very steep slope.
Yeah, but I still think there are people who think I'd rather do the slope than walk that long distance. At least some. I mean, not a mob of people. I'm just thinking
That's why I said.
there are going to be some.
Sure.
And so I'm trying to figure, is there just not some way we can, slope or not, that we can get people across there with a bridge? Even a bridge that's high and then steps down, or slopes down or whatever. Because I'm just not, particularly after a long game or something and maybe drinking too much something or other, there are going to be people that are doing that.
Sure. Okay, so that's, obviously that's something that we'll consider is some way to improve that access.
And I just want to, you had a couple suggestions to kids' play areas, and I like the idea of kids' play areas in there. This is the heart of Kid Kingdom up there. This is where in Littleton I think the most amount of kids go is those parks, that whole park complex, either side of Bellevue or whatever, and I think it's appropriate that a maximum consideration be given to that, and I liked the rustic look along the lines of, it's kind of a rustic area, but I really like the emphasis on some kid play areas.
So now, in the evenings, when it starts getting dusk, are we going to have lighting in there, or is this going to be a vulnerable place to get whacked on the head?
So we haven't talked about really adding a lot of lighting other than what's currently there. So I think that would be probably security lighting in shelters and some of those kind of things. But not lighting along like Big Dry Creek Trail or anything like that.
Okay.
And I don't think would be an appropriate place for a lot of lights anyway. That's one of the beauties of that park.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Wild park.
Yeah,
But
no.
I was thinking about that too. What about did you get police input on this as well? Because I know you probably spent a little time down there. Yeah. Did the police comment as well?
I don't think we have any specific comments from police.
Because this would not, I mean, this would be totally accessible, just like Stern Park is, any time of the day, right?
What do you mean?
And
by
just like
totally
Stern Park,
accessible?
sometimes some illegal behaviors are occurring.
It would be worthwhile to get some police information. I don't know what they'd say particularly, but that is an interesting park for a lot of reasons, and it is that isolation issue, and it's isolated, very isolated at night.
Yeah, my friends used to tell me that there's a lot of partying going on down.
Your friends used to tell you, when you were at home doing your
friends
homework.
did, well,
He was at home doing his homework.
Exactly.
Mark has a question.
Mark, if I may just, I think I've just kind of remembered here that the Public Works staff had engaged CDOT here just recently, this past year, with that multifamily area just to the east side there on Bellevue, looking for an opportunity to actually create some sidewalk in there and use CDBG funds. So that conversation actually is still continuing.
Okay.
So this may be an opportunity to kind of expand that, I guess, and maybe connect it here a little bit better to the park.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we've talked about orientation of the fields. So improvements to the fields would include dugouts, backstops. A little side note, we did have a pretty lengthy discussion with Excel, actually, because there are some significant transmission lines. There's a tower right here. So we had some thoughts about trying to locate both ball fields right here as a little complex, and ultimately that was decided against because Excel was very concerned about the baseball field with the transmission lines. But in particular, this backstop would be hooded, similar to those, to, again, just try to reduce the conflict between baseballs and the transmission lines. And then another thing that we looked at is having, I guess you could call it an adventure path, a discovery path, that really follows Big Dry Creek Trail. And this would be a smaller Crusher Finds experience with all those little boxes along the way are sort of access points. So something like this along Big Dry Creek. with some opportunities to interact with the creek. Something less formal than what you see in Bellevue Park, but it's really more consistent with this riparian corridor. So currently looking at phase 1 improvements, and right now the intent is for the first phase to include a new restroom building, shelter, and that central plaza area. So current funding for that is $800,000, so that's $200,000 from South Suburban, $200,000 from City of Littleton, and then $400,000 from Arapahoe County Open Space.
And that's reorienting the fields?
No, and let me clarify, that is a grant that South Suburban or the City of Littleton would be applying for this summer.
Probably need a mic so I can hear you.
I can do that for you.
So my question was, does it include orienting the field?
It does not.
So this would be a multi-phase project, with the first phase being proposed to the restroom, the shelter, and the plaza area. The funding source that you see up there, the $200,000 from South Suburban and the City of Littleton were allocated in the 2017 budgets. The $400,000 is a large opportunity grant from Arapahoe County Open Space. That grant is due in August, and we'll find out if we receive funding or not in December. Should we not receive funding, we have had conversations that perhaps the district and the city would want to backfill that funding by appropriating additional funds in 2018. Another option could be to apply for a standard grant in February of 2018. And there's some things that get into play there as to how much funding we get and how it works together. But there is a potential, if we could get enough grant funding and additional funds from the district and the city, there would be a potential to also build the playground as part of phase 1.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. So part of the reasoning for that being the first phase is we heard a lot of complaints about the shelter and restroom building. Another is there's an opportunity to make those improvements to basically remove the old shelter and restroom and build that new area without impacting most of the existing facilities. There's some impact to the playground, but it's relatively minor. So
Does the shelter, main shelter, is it the same location then as the existing?
it's very close. The existing shelter is approximately right here. Proposed is right here. And the restroom, same thing. The restroom is actually very close to the existing location. So there's some benefit there in terms of cost as well, because we don't have to run utilities for a long distance and those kind of things.
And what's wrong with the existing?
For the most part, they're outdated, they're undersized. They've just, they're not currently serving the level of service that you would expect for a park. And I think that's all we have to present. Any other questions?
Since you're building new structures, you're tearing down old structures and building new structures within the floodplain, is there any additional, I guess, permissions you would have to do in order to do that? Even though the City of Littleton owns the property, would we still have to go through and get proper permits to be able to do that?
Yes. And the intent is to actually raise that area. It doesn't require too much. The location that we're showing that restroom building is selected for a couple of reasons. One, it's sort of centrally located to the park, but it's also one of the highest points in the park. So by raising that just slightly, we'll be able to get it out of the floodplain. But yes, there would have to be permitting for that to occur.
You might want to reach out to Urban Drainage and Flood Control, because they will, they've always been partners on when we have to make changes to floodplain, and anytime we can get something out of the floodplain, they come with funding for stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
They're great partners.
Absolutely.
How many phases do you anticipate to complete the entire plan? And what phase would include the parking upgrades?
Phasing is really subject to funding. What we are showing you, it is a very ambitious plan with an overall cost estimate of approximately $5 million. And again, it's a master plan, so it's a blueprint for something to build towards in the future. And then where we go from there will fall within what are the priorities of the district and the city as we look at funding various projects in the future. So again, there's no reason it has to be all built at once. It could be a 30-year plan. It could be a shorter plan, depending on the priorities of our two entities.
I'm sorry, you said the overall cost was
Approximately $5 million.
$5 million. Okay.
And I know that's a shocking number,
Million,
but
yeah.
in today's construction costs, that's not overly surprising. Just to look at the shelter, the restroom, the plaza, and the playground, it's a $1.3 million project. And that, ideally, that was our preferred Phase 1 project, but with only having up to $800,000 available in 2017, that's why we've scaled it back to just the shelter, restroom, and plaza.
Any additional questions? Not seeing any. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
So on our agenda, that completes discussion of the two master plans.
Thank you.
Any other discussion anyone would like to have on items A or B? If not, then we would have a brief recess to move ahead to our final discussion. John?
Nothing else from me? Anybody from South Suburban want to make any final comments?
Thank you all for coming.
Okay.
Thank you all for your time. South Suburban will be considering the management agreement tomorrow night in a regular meeting.
Okay, well, we'll be on it. Let's take about a 5-minute break, and we'll get ready to finish up.
Cuts to my bones, but I'm still unbreakable. Yeah, you make me scared to even open up my eyes. Sometimes there's nowhere out and nowhere left to hide. I can't escape you, couldn't kill you if I tried. Some days you're poison and you leave me paralyzed. But even when it's darkest, and even at its hardest, I'll finish what you started. I will never stop the fight. You kept me low, but I'm not dysfunctional. Tear down one wall, but I'm three-dimensional. You can never crush me from inside out, no. Cut to my bones, but I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. You're just a nightmare, you burn right through my mind. Bring out my fears and watch them eat me up alive. You make me lose myself and crash like suicide, yeah. You do your worst, but I will find a way to rise. But even when it's darkest, and even at its hardest, I'll finish what you started. I will never stop the fight. You kept me low, but I'm not dysfunctional. Tear down one wall, but I'm three-dimensional. You can never crush me from inside out, no. Cut to my bones, but I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. Until forever, as lost as it seems. No, you'll never break me. You kept me low, but I'm not dysfunctional. Tear down one wall, but I'm three-dimensional. You can never crush me from inside out. Cut to my bones, but I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, yeah, I'm still unbreakable. You cut me to my bones, I'm still unbreakable. Whoa, I'm still unbreakable. But I'm still unbreakable.
We're just back in session. We've completed our planned agenda items for the study session. We just wanted to do a catch-up update from Mayor Pro Tem on some fire consolidation issues.
Yeah, just a real quick notice to you guys that Mark has put together a letter that we had a conversation about the looping in, creating a more inclusive loop of communication with the South Metro Board. Part of what the group that I'm meeting with, we call, like, I think I told you guys, the 5 alarms, which is an elected from each of the 5 entities, that has proven to be very informative and very opportunistic in terms of sharing information that we may not be getting otherwise, primarily because we don't have a system set up. So what we've recommended to the partners and what they have agreed is a good idea is to have the city manager be the focus or the kind of the clearinghouse for communication. So it comes in there and it comes out of there. And having our consultant also, that helps with that, so that they're able to have a resource where they can go and get the information current, updated, and correct. And so in an attempt to make sure that we have included all of those that need to be part of this, the South Metro Board obviously needs to be part of that loop of communication. So the letter, which you guys will receive either this evening or tomorrow, Mark will send out. We're waiting for some comments back from the district at this point. Take a look at it, and if you have any comments or edits, let Mark know. But the intention is this is going to South Metro and to Chief Baker from the partners via Mark, and basically says we just want to create this line of communication. This is what we've agreed upon with our partner group, and so looping you into that, let us know where you stand on that. So I think that if we go too far down the road and we haven't included this board and we're only working on the level of our boards and the chiefs, I think we may find ourselves wishing we had done this sooner than later. So I think it's a good step. Take a look at the letter tomorrow as soon as you get it and as soon as you can get it back, because Mark would like to get it out this week.
Comments back to Mark, please.
Comments back to Mark, and it would go out this week. Mark will be Friday vacation, but Mike will be able to back up, and Mark will be in communication through electronic anyway. So.
Okay, so clarify, comments back to you by when?
Oh, it's tomorrow.
Yeah,
or Thursday.
I would appreciate it if possible. I'll send it out in the morning, but if I got the comments say Thursday morning is probably fine, but I'd like to send a letter here by the end of the week.
Okay.
Any other discussion?
That's it.
We are dismissed.
Thank you.